Good afternoon. It's terrific to be here with you this afternoon, and I'm going to. Deborah gave me this topic and global perspective on Cabernet management strategies, and I thought, that's pretty broad. And so my immediate thought was, well, I should refine it down. And I said, well, that's nuts. It gives me an opportunity to talk about whatever I want to talk about. So I get a chance to tell you some of the things that I find as interesting and somewhat kind of pet peeves about or ideas that I'm really trying to pursue. Does sound okay for everyone? One of the pivotal things that occurred in my experience in the wine industry occurred probably in about 1976, 1977, something like that. I had an opportunity to go on a trip. I was recently had come into the wine industry from an academic career, and I had an opportunity to go on a trip with Andrei Chelichev, one of his French trips, where he would go and tour areas. And I was having an opportunity to work with Andrei a little bit with one of the organizations that I was working with. And I said to Andrei, I said, I'd like to go on one of these trips, but what I understand is you taste a lot of wines and you see a lot of different facilities. I said, that's all well and good, but what I'd really love to do is I'd love to see the linkage between the vineyard and the outcome in the wine. Any of you know Andrei, Michael, I know you know how he gets this puzzled, he would get this sort of puzzled look, and then you get this kind of glimmer in his eye, and then he'd sort of like explode in this like, oh yes, that's a great idea. So we had an opportunity to spend, and he took that really seriously. We had a lot of opportunity. We'd visit vineyards, see wineries, taste wines, see vineyards back and forth. Well, the real nugget, other than the fact that it was a terrific trip, was that I came home at that point in the late 70s with this concept about growing wine. And I really got it on a visit, I think, subsequently to Burgundy. One of my all-time heroes in the wine industry in Burgundy, I love red Burgundy, was Henri Jaillet. And whenever you go to visit Henri Jaillet, you'd have to go extract him from the field. He was out there doing something. And here's this winemaker who's so gifted, but he was always saying, well, I need to go to the vineyard, he'd come and find me in the vineyard. So the concept about growing wine, then when I had the opportunity to start my own business, I said, well, I'll just use the term WineGrow because that's really what I love to do. What I'd like to tell you about today are some of the things that I've made as observations and use as much as possible some material I extracted from the experience, and also the literature. And so my key things I'd like to try to tell you about today really have to do with phenology. Many of you probably know this is really a bug that I'm on, and the timeline. It's I call it the Xaxis. It's your timeline for the entire vintage, and it tells you so much and gives you so many opportunities. Vines and fruit and sun exposure, we've heard about that some today, and I'd like to say a couple words about it. A couple of words about ripening and shoot quality. We do a lot of things in vineyards, but I'd like to talk a little bit about shoot lengths and quality and the outcome, at least relative to some ripening characteristics, and a little bit about variability of ripening, specifically from the standpoint of just sugar. Now, on phenology, I'm not sure how clearly these are going to come through, but this is lifted out of a South African publication by Brian Coombe, where he really assembled for a very, I think probably the first times it was assembled exactly like this, 47 different stages of vine development. Now, you might think, well, that's a little bit tedious, but what you can do, and I think there'll be copies of this available online and probably a little bit better resolution, but what you can do is you can really follow a vine all the way from bud swell through, opening through the stages and down into, flowering all the way through, cap fall, bunch closure and so forth. It's always nice if you're communicating with people to be able to have something to say, this is what I am seeing. And to that end, also, if you're making those observations in your own vineyards and you're keeping a really good record of them, in your annual sort of records, you'll find out that there's a lot of regularity in a grapevine. And these are just some photos of the different stages. Stages indicated here. Does that look out of focus to everyone or just to me? Anyway, so full flowering here, stage 23, stage 35, beginning of ripening and so forth. But so there's just some indications pictorially. Just to back up for a second and talk a little bit about why phenology is important. The bud burst of flowering I call a squishy number. Bud burst of flowering in most areas is very, very much dependent on the amount of heat that you get. And we know that in springtime, this one being a good one, that you can have very cool springs. You may have bud burst that's early, but you may not have flowering for a rather long period of time. And you'll find that if you collect the data, bud burst of flowering in a vineyard in the heart of Napa, Sonoma, probably anywhere in California, most places in the world, you'll get a very a squishy number. It'll change a lot, and I'll show you some data on that in a little bit. But once you get to the other stages of vine development, fruit development, they're very reproducible. And that's simply because we have more heat than is actually required. I call it heat saturating. We have more heat than is really required to move the vine along sequentially from stage to stage. The other aspect is the timing between the stages, not just the start and the finish of the vine from flowering to harvest, but the timing between stages is very regular. And you can see that, and people will say, well, we're early, or we're late getting started, but we'll catch up. And I always hate to bust people's bubble in that, because it really doesn't happen that way. And having us say, well, we'll get a lot of heat and things, and the vines will catch up. Usually, if we have a lot of heat, they actually slow down. They're really kind of obstreperous. They say, well, it's too warm. I don't want to go as fast. And I've looked at very, very warm areas within California, and in fact, usually the timing is slightly stretched out for those very warm areas. I indicated here it's not the calendar date, but rather the phenological date. And so I oftentimes say to people, once you see flowering, you can kind of throw away your calendar on the wall, and then you can start to work on your phenology calendar, which is going to be very, very regular. And the important part is it tells you a lot of the things you need to do with and in the vineyard. And I'm not going to go into great detail, but what I really like to do most times when people are recording, say, an event in a vineyard, they'll say 50%. Being the middle of flowering or the middle of veraison. And I'm here to bear witness to the fact that's a very difficult number to try to evaluate in a vineyard, not only within the bunch, within the vine, but within sections or between sections of the vineyard. What I like to do is to look at the beginning and the end. You can tell the beginning and the end of a process rather precisely. And I use the example, for example, if you had let's take a Cabernet cluster, and I'll say roughly amongst friends, there are about 300 flowers in that little bunch that's out there right now. And if 5% of those are going to be flowering, it means you'd have about 15 of them open. And it's easier to recognize when 15 is open rather than half of them, of all those in that cluster. And likewise on the other side, that means that there would be very few of them left that had not opened when you're at 95%. Okay, other than being a better way to estimate the entire process, what it also does is then once you know this 5 to 95%, and you watch this data very, very closely from season to season, first thing you're going to pick up on is the fact that it's different season to season. Sometimes that 5 to 95% may be 5 days, which is a really tight window, and I've seen it go 14 days. The important part, and the nugget here, is the first flower to open is the first one to ripen. So it's not only is the phenology regular for the vine itself, for the cluster, but it's also regular for the berry. And the first berry to flower is going to be the first one to ripen. And if it's a very wide window, say it's 2 weeks, that's a very wide window, and you're accumulating at least 1.5 degrees Brix per week, it means that at the bare minimum, you have a 3 degree Brix variation within that very wide window, if you follow that example. So it's an important thing to tell you, it's an important observation you can make to tell you relatively how diverse your population is out there. May influence your thinning, for example, veraison thinning and or some other activities. We do something totally goofy with our South African project. We actually berry thin within the cluster. So if we have a very wide window of flowering, we'll go in at veraison, we'll do a veraison thin on bunches, and then we'll come back in at the finish, and if there's still green berries inside the bunches, then we go through and pick out the green berries. This is going to be really probably fairly hard to see, but what I'm going to do here is show you a little bit of data that is based on I think this is about 45 years of history. This is extracted by Greg Jones from some Bordeaux data. And what he's looked at is a number of different stages. And the first one that's circled up here is this bud burst to flowering, bud burst to veraison, and bud burst to harvest. You don't have to remember the numbers, just remember that you can see that these numbers are fairly large. It's a long time from bud burst to the finish. But look at this number that's in heavy here, the standard deviation, and it jumps all over the place. And you can see the maximum numbers run from, in the 200 range, but the minimum numbers are really widely spread as well. So this is just put up here to reinforce the fact that this is a definition of squishy to me. It's a squishy number, bud burst to any event. However, once you start to look at flowering to veraison and flowering to harvest, you'll see these two numbers here, which are very good numbers, and we'll come back to those. And I always remember sort of 65 days from flowering to veraison and total of about 110 to 120 days from flowering to harvest. That's very useful because it gives you an idea. Once you see flowering, it's kind of like you've turned over the hourglass and you have 110 or 120 days worth of sand to run through that. And it's kind of like, what am I going to do today to make sure that I arrive and I'm prepared for when that harvest comes? But the important thing is that the standard deviation is rather small here, and it's rather predictable. Now, just focusing a little bit on veraison to harvest, here's this 45 days that if you sum the flowering to veraison and then the veraison to harvest, you're going to come up with these, in the range of 110 to 120 days, depending on where you are. Again, the standard deviation is fairly small, and you can see the max and min have some variation in here, but over the 40 years in Bordeaux, they were very, very close. This is another example. You say, well, that's maybe, we don't know the sites, whatever. There must be an effect on by gravel, by sand, or by clay soils, or by variety, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, and Cabernet Sauvignon. I'm just going to focus here on the flowering to harvest because that's the thing I'm on here. And you look at these, I don't know, again, I'll just read through them quickly. The gravel flowering to harvest was 114 days, the sand was 114 days, and the clay was 115 days. And this was, I think this was only 5 years worth of data, but as we look at the yearly data, you'll see there's some variation in it, but they're pretty regular. You look at Merlot, about 110 days. I see that as a very good number. We have Merlot blocks in our South African vineyard. I use 104 to 107 days. And when I say I use it, that is when I see flowering, I book my travel for harvest. So when I see it in the last week of October, first week of November, I book my travel for January because in January, everyone in the Northern Hemisphere wants to go to South Africa out of Europe because it's warm and they can play golf there. And if I wait wait until I see veraison, I never can get a flight booked. So here's Cultivar, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, and you see the Cabernet is up around 120 days. And you look at the vintage, and there's some vintage to vintage variation, but in general, that's pretty consistent numbers, anywhere from 109 over here to 123 in 1997. Anyway, just to kind of put a wrap on phenology, you can tell I'm pretty excited about using this as a tool. And I've used it for a long time, and I keep trying to encourage people to use it so that you've got some ability to predict some of the things that are going to occur for you. Flowering dates and fungicide sprays, particularly when you're going to cut off your pre-harvest, your last spray, your last application pre-harvest. saying I'm going to stop, 70 days pre or 60 days pre-harvest implies that you know when harvest is going to occur. Once you get a little bit of data for your blocks, you're going to know that precisely. Water management, when historically we've always used these kind of models before the ones that Martin talked about of this ramp up at a 20 degrees Brix, we've always used numbers relative to pre-harvest cutoffs and cutbacks. That actually was very helpful if you know when harvest is going to occur. Planning for timing needs, and particularly the one that I see as a real labor crunch for us oftentimes is veraison thinning. Veraison thinning is a big bang, high noon kind of event. It's like Monday's too early and Wednesday's too late kind of thing if you're really going to catch it exactly, to not over thin or to under thin. And of course, harvest timing. And one of the things I've always enjoyed is that you ask a Frenchman when they're going to take their holidays, and they know precisely once they've seen flowering. And they always just squeak it out, they get back just in time before, and I see Michael chuckling there. But I've seen them miss it occasionally, but usually they just got to scoot in, they slide into home base, and, everything's all calm and collected, and, harvest begins. And they figured that a long time ago. And of course, are you in the winery? This is just a way to look somewhat pictorially at some of the events that are going on, and many of you have probably seen this, but there's a lot of information there, but I put this red loop around the x-axis down here. Again, this is a good example of how you'd use the x-axis, and think about things like the ripening curve, phloem transport. This represents berry sizing, your veraison time, and then coloring as you go up into the final stages. And you can do your bricks against there. You can look at some of the development of different characters or characteristics, as Martin was talking about and other speakers. So it's another way to take a look at that. I'm now going to switch gears on you a little bit, and just a couple words about fruit exposure and temperature. And I'm of an era, and I can remember that when, and I'm not picking on Dick Smart here, but when he was coming to California and he was saying, look, you have to put all your rows north-south, get all this afternoon sun exposure on your fruit that you can. And I was never really a subscriber to that theory. And Nick DeCruzley and other people have actually published the data that shows that. And let's just do it because this figure is in centigrade. And what we're looking at, and we're just going to look at the top panel here for this. It's important to know, first of all, here are your conversions, and optimum temperature for enzyme and anthocyanin pathway is somewhere between 62 and 79 degrees Fahrenheit. I bet that's a bit of a surprise if you haven't really thought about it, how low that is relative to the ambient temperatures that we often get here. And the nugget that comes out of this is that red grapes can be up to 10 degrees centigrade warmer than your ambient temperature if they're in direct sunlight. And what that means is if you, for example, had ambient temperature of 85 degrees, you could have fruit easily at 102 degrees. Well, just compare 102 to what this optimum here is. And basically what's happening in these direct exposures with dark colored fruit is you're frying the biochemistry. There aren't any enzymes in the biology of grapevines that really work very efficiently at 102 degrees. And this figure up above just shows temperature versus time, the time of the day, and here's the exposed fruit, and you can see how much above in the open circles here, this figure, this line right here, is open circles. You heard earlier speakers talk about shaded fruit versus exposed fruit. This is just another way of looking at it. So ambient temperature here, exposed fruit on the top. You can see not only is it hotter, but it's hotter for a longer period of time. So it's the concept about the dosage as well. Dosage is the amount and the time in this particular. One of the reasons I think that people get into become convinced about a lot of sun exposure on their fruit is elegantly displayed here by both that earlier figure, the one with a pretty picture with all the evolution on it for the season, but also some work that Linda Besson has done. And you can follow through the kind of progression of Cabernet characters, vegetative to herbaceous, unripe fruit, red fruit, black fruit, and into jam. And here are some of the descriptors under each one of those that she's assembled for that. It's important to note, though, just because we draw it in a connected line here, or she draws in a connected line, doesn't mean that all of the characters that are vegetal or herbaceous move into unripe fruit and then red fruit and then black fruit. Sometimes you'll have fruit that is not kind of keeping up with the program, and they never will overcome it. And I think Martin's work is probably a really good example of that in the data that says that the vintages vary. And so we see sometimes where fruit becomes stuck in kind of one of these descriptor buckets or categories, and doesn't really move forward. So just because it's there, and we would expect that it's going to move in that, it doesn't always work that. Likewise, you look at some of the stem flavorant composition, and this again is from work that Linda Besson has done. And so you see these unripe and ripe characters, you can trace them across. The green, kind of vegetal, leafy, all the things we would think about. Ripe characters, you start to see brownness in the browning in the rachis, and then some of these descriptors. But you can also get stems overripe, and the downside is you get these dried leaf, herbal, and tea characters, which are not very positive either in your wines when you're getting those extractions. A word or two about uneven fruit ripening here. I said here that non-uniform fruit ripening, going back to the phenology discussion that we had there as I started, these wide windows, 5 to 95%, being a diverse population, the wider that window is, you have to realize that Mother Nature is pretty crafty, and the grapevine's been around for a very long time. And it's a really flawed strategy to have all of the fruit ripen at the same time. The reason that's a flawed strategy is because the fruit ripening is coincident with seed ripening in most times. And if you're really trying to disperse the seed and ensure, as a plant, ensure that you are surviving on this in this fairly harsh environment, there's no way you'd want all the fruit to ripen at the same time, because it means all the seeds would ripen at the same time. And if your vectors, such as birds, squirrels, raccoons, and so forth, come by, and the fruit isn't ripened, they reject it and they move on. Well, there's no way for the grapevine to move around other than use some vector. And so what you want is, it's kind of like a buffet. You always want some fruit that's just ripening over a very long period of time if you're trying to survive. If you're trying to make wine, that's exactly the opposite thing you want to have happen. So we spend a lot of time and energy down to, as I said, plucking individual green berries out of clusters to try to overcome some of those green characters that could be contributed from underripe fruit. So I just restated here that for winemaking objectives, it really doesn't work for us. And I said earlier that you get lots of opportunities for variation, all the way from your macro effects of within vineyard to within the vine, bunch to bunch, and even berry to berry within the cluster. And this is an example of a tool that we use. This is a production scale tool that we use, and in that every block is sampled this way at least once every vintage for our project. And it's a little tedious, and this is why we have interns. Because interns love this kind of thing. Hey man, I'm going to go out and collect 300 berries. I'm going to come back. They sit down very patiently. They read the sugar content on a digital refractometer on every single one of those berries, and then they dump the data off to me, and then I just look at it. And what I'm looking for is, what's that profile look like? I think this is going to be hard to read. On the vertical axis here is really frequency, and so what it says at the bottom seems to be in better focus. So it says that there were maximum of 14 berries in any one of these categories as frequency, versus on the lower axis, the horizontal x-axis there, that's Brix, that's the sugar content, and we look at every 1/10 of a degree Brix. And then all I'm doing is just simply plotting the profile of a forest here or something like that, is how frequently. So these are one berry at whatever that sugar was. It's probably about 19, 18 and a half. One berry there, one berry there, one berry there, one berry there. And then you start to see know what the distribution is, and then you get this population out here in front. This is exactly the same vineyard, and it's a 2.5 acre block, and it's a fairly long, narrow block that has about maybe a 2-3% slope, but I know it's different soil type, and this is the upper part of the block, and this is the lower part of the block, harvested on the same day, just split by that. So you can see that this is going to tend to have more green character brought in because you have underripe berries. You go out there and you take 300 berry sample, you mush up the entire sample, and the average here that you get in both of these is exactly the same. I don't know what it is, 25.7, I think. Both of those samples, if you mush up the 300 berries and you read them, you get 25.7. Bang, bang, 25.7. Exactly the same. Are they the same? No way. From a winemaking standpoint, they are hugely different. So that's why we look at this, and then we decide whether we're going to wait a little bit, or what kind of work we're going to do. And then on top of it, we do berry sorting on the cluster sorting and berry sorting both when the fruit comes to the wine. Switching gears again. I said I'd talk a little bit about Cabernet Sauvignon and shoot length or shoot quality. And this is and it's supposed to be global, so I said, well, let's draw in South Africa again. Even Archer did this work a fair while ago, but it's still pretty durable. And what he did here is he said, okay, let's go out, and they took a vineyard, just went into a vineyard, no treatment here, this is observations. And he said, let's take shoots that are 60 centimeters in length, shoots that are 120, let's call 124 feet, that's probably about 15 to 17 internodes and leaves there. And then let's take long shoots at 200 here. And that's a very long shoot, probably gangly, running down the canopy and all kinds of other things. And then let's just look at the sugar concentration, 24 at 60, 24.5 at 120, and then look at this. The longer shoot, actually giving lower sugar. And then you look at the acid concentration, the pH, and also skin color. And you can see that if you look at the loop around this middle category, those are the characteristics you're really looking for. The best 520 reading, good pH, good acid, and good sugar. Although, as we see today, that's a relatively low sugar for what people are doing today. But the point is that this quality of the shoot really can be evaluated. Now, let me tell you that I've done this a number of times myself, and most of the time I see this result. There are times when I don't see this result. But yet, in vineyards on a production basis, when we're out there, when I'm working with Cabernet, we will, on an almost a routine basis, will remove fruit off of these inferior length shoots. And the reason why is because we don't know. We don't know. I've seen cases where this works perfectly. I've seen other cases where weaker shoots still are actually pretty good quality fruit. But the point is we don't know. And almost every producer that I work with isn't willing to take a chance that they're going to get this low performance and have a more diverse population, especially in a green character. And that's it. And this is not our vineyard, but it's just a normal run-of-the-day shop at vineyards in South Africa. And so with that, I'm going to stop, and by my calculation, I have a couple minutes for questions or comments. And sorry, I covered a lot of information there very quickly, but if I can elucidate anything. Yes, ma'am.
Do you want to talk about spur pruning versus cane pruning on Cabernet?
Do I want to talk about spur versus cane? Sure. Although I'll have to admit to you that I use something that's a mix, okay? And I'm not going to go into great detail. What I learned a long time ago is that I like attributes of cane pruning and I like attributes of cordon pruning. One of the attributes about that I find is a problem about cane pruning is getting really people who understand enough of the vine physiology to be able to make really high quality decisions. I'm also about which wood to leave and how to keep shaping a vine so that the pruner has to look at it every year that they're pruning it. They have to look at it. I ask them to look 3-5 years down the road. If you make that cut today, you leave this cane or that spur, how's that vine going to look next year? How are we going to sucker it? So there are a lot of decisions that need to be made. For all the positive sides of cane pruning, I think there's some drawbacks, especially when one works with a labor source that may not be as well schooled as, for example, Michael talked about. On the flip side, just one more comment. One of the things I hate to see is cane pruning with very long canes and then all the weak shoots that come in the middle of it. Because then, what I showed you here is we wind up going back and throwing that fruit on the ground. That really seems like remedial viticulture at that point. Why do we have to prune and then throw fruit on the ground? So I'm actually leaning towards cordon pruning myself because we get more regularity, get more wood and so forth. But I put a twist on it in that what I started doing quite some time ago, and I use it in California, I use it in South Africa, and I'm using it at a project in Israel, and it's introduced now into France as well, is where we train cordons, but we train cordons so that they actually look like a cane prune vine. That is, we leave a spur position at every position instead of saying, here's a two-bud spur and a giant space by cutting out one of the positions, and then we leave another two-bud spur. What we do when we're training with vines is we leave a position at every spot on that cane, quote cane. And you say, well, one shoots down and one's up. That's true, but a vinifera likes to grow straight up. And the second or third year, that downward-oriented shoot, you've got a vertically oriented shoot. What it does then, we prune this thing to one-bud spurs. So essentially, if no one really showed you, you get the shoot density, even shoot density of cane pruning without a dip in the middle, and you get the kind of uniform fruit exposure without having two shoots bunched up, a space, and two shoots bunched up. You can do the calculation and get average shoot density, but average ain't the same as having it evenly spaced in the first place. So we get the best of cane and we get the best of cordon that way. That's a real quick tour through that. If anybody wants to talk about that, I can tell you more about it. But so right now, if you're going to cane prune in my mind, you need to have a site that is a fairly low vigor site. That is, you can put the vines close together, so you can leave short canes. And so short canes, then you don't have the mid-cane weak shoot emphasis, and you don't have to wind up throwing a lot of fruit on the ground, and you need a pretty sophisticated, well-trained Ripening Curve. So do I have thoughts on it? Yeah, I do. Sorry, I just, you asked the question, I figured I'd go for it.
That's why I asked the question.
Yeah, I know. I paid him to do that. Okay. Any other comments? Yeah.
Did you have any challenges with finding disease-free plant material or diversity of the plant, of the clones that you wanted to plant in your
Specifically to South Africa, is that the question? Availability of disease-free material, yes. It's a big issue, and I think it's a big issue worldwide, and I think it's because it's probably the freedom from disease through leaving foundation programs wherever they are in the world, getting them through nursery production and into vineyards. There are just so many things that can go amiss, and so we do. And we have a somewhat narrower range of plant material than quite a bit narrower range of plant material than is here in California. And so it's a bit of a challenge. So we just have to work through it and find things that work. And we found some that work very well for us. And you got a nice tune. We just keep singing the same one over and over again, and really use our site variability to get some of the extra.